She weighed more than any man in that town dared to love, and every single one of them knew her name. Mara Whitlock had cooked 1,000 meals for people who never once asked how she was doing. She had buried her mother alone, survived 3 winters without a man's help, and still managed to keep the lights burning in a cabin no one visited unless they were hungry. Then one night, a man knocked on her door in a blizzard. Not to court her, not to save her. He needed her. And that changed everything. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. You will not regret it. Black Hollow, Colorado Territory. November 1879. The snow came early that year. It came without warning, the way bad things usually do in frontier country. One morning, the sky was pale and gray and holding its breath, and by afternoon, the whole world had gone white and silent and mean. The kind of cold that didn't just chill you, the kind that reminded you exactly how small you were against the size of everything else. Black Hollow sat in a valley between 2 ridges, and it caught wind like a bucket catches rain. The main street, if you could call a rutted stretch of frozen mud between 12 buildings a main street, emptied out by 3 in the afternoon most winter days. Horses stood miserable at hitching posts. Smoke crawled sideways from chimney stacks. The whole town seemed to be bracing itself. Mara Whitlock was used to the cold. She'd grown up in it, grown through it, the way a tree grows through a fence. Not around the obstacle, but right into it, until the wood and the iron became one thing you couldn't separate anymore. Her cabin sat at the eastern edge of town, just past the cooper's shop and before the tree line began. It was small. It was hers. And every morning she woke up in it without anyone asking her to leave. She considered that a kind of victory. She was 31 years old that November, heavy set in the way that strong women sometimes are, broad through the shoulders, solid in the hips, with hands that had worked so long and so hard, they developed a kind of permanent roughness that no amount of lard or careful treatment could quite undo. Her hair was dark brown with the first threads of early gray working through it near her temples, and she kept it pulled back in a knot because loose hair and open flames were a foolish combination, and Mara Whitlock had never been a foolish woman. Her face was plain, if you were being unkind, serious, if you were being honest. She had dark eyes that noticed things, a wide mouth that didn't smile carelessly, and a jaw that suggested she'd made up her mind about most things years ago and wasn't especially interested in revisiting those decisions. She was not what Black Hollow would call a handsome woman. She knew this. She had always known this. The way you know something that gets told to you not once, but 100 times in 100 different ways. Some of them cruel and direct, most of them not, because people prefer their cruelty wrapped in something more comfortable. A look that slid past you too quickly. A conversation that stopped just as you walked up. An invitation that never quite arrived. Mara had stopped expecting invitations somewhere around age 24. That particular Tuesday morning, she was up before dawn, which was not unusual. She had a pot of dried beans soaking overnight that needed to go on the fire, and she had an order from the Calloway family. The blacksmith's wife had asked for 2 loaves of her rye bread and a jar of her apple butter to be ready before noon. Mara baked for people, cooked for people, did the kind of work that kept a woman fed and housed and independent, which mattered far more to her than any of the other things women in Black Hollow were supposed to want. She got the fire going, checked the beans, and started on the bread dough while the light outside the window went from black to a bruised sort of purple. The snow had stopped overnight, but the temperature had dropped hard, and the cabin walls popped and settled in the cold the way old wood does. She worked in silence. She liked silence. It was the one thing in her life that had never once judged her. By 10 o'clock, she had the bread in the oven, a squat little iron stove she'd bought off a departing family 6 years ago for $3 and a pot of beef stew. And she was starting on a pot of venison soup for her own supper when she heard boots on her porch steps. She didn't look up right away. People knocked when they wanted something. She'd learned not to hope it was anything other than that. The knock came. 2 hard raps, businesslike. "It's open," she called. The door swung in and brought a gust of frozen air with it. The man who filled the doorframe was tall, taller than her doorframe was quite comfortable with, she noticed, because he ducked slightly coming through, which wasn't something many men had to do. He was somewhere in his late 30s, maybe pushing 40, with the kind of weathered face that said he'd spent more years outdoors than in. His jaw was dark with 3 or 4 days of growth. His coat was good quality, wool, with a sheepskin collar, but it was dirty at the cuffs, and one button had been replaced with something that didn't quite match. His hat was in his hands. He looked around her kitchen for a moment before his eyes settled on her. "You're Mara Whitlock?" he asked. "I am," she said, still stirring. "Who's asking?" "Rhett Mercer," he said. "I own the Mercer Ridge Ranch, about 9 miles northeast." She knew the name. Everybody in Black Hollow knew the name. Mercer Ridge was one of the bigger cattle operations in the valley, had been for 20 years. His father had built it, and Rhett had inherited it, or fought for it, or some combination of both depending on which version of the story you were getting and from whom. She'd seen him at the general store a handful of times over the years. Never spoken to him. "All right," she said. "What do you need, Mr. Mercer?" He stood there for a second in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with what he'd come to say. His jaw worked once, like he was deciding something. "I need a cook," he said. "A real one. I've got 14 men on that ranch through winter, and the last 2 women who came out to cook both left before the first snow. One of them lasted 11 days. Mara set her spoon down and turned to look at him properly for the first time. "Why'd they leave?" "One said the men were too rough. The other didn't say anything, just packed up while everybody was out working." He paused. "My men aren't animals. They're cowhands. They're not polite. The work's hard and the hours are long, and I can't pretend otherwise." "What are you paying?" $20 a month, room and meals included. Your own space in the main house, separate from the bunkhouse." That was real money. More than she was making selling bread and soup to the 12 families in Black Hollow who could afford to buy it. Mara studied him. He didn't look away, which she noticed. Most men, when they looked at her, looked slightly to the side of her, or past her, or at something in the room that wasn't her. As if looking directly at her required a kind of acknowledgement they weren't quite prepared to give. Rhett Mercer was looking directly at her. "Why me?" she asked. "There are other women in this town who cook." He was quiet for a moment. "Bertie Halloran at the boarding house told me if I wanted somebody who'd actually stay the winter and wouldn't spook at the work, I should come talk to you." He said it flat, without decoration. She said you were tough. "Bertie thinks I'm stubborn," Mara said. "That's different from tough." "Maybe," he said. "But from where I'm standing, that might be the same thing." She looked at her kitchen, the bread in the oven, the soup on the fire, the neat rows of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam, the order of apple butter waiting in its jar on the shelf. All of it hers, all of it small. "I should tell you something," she said, and she made herself say it plainly because she had learned that plainness saved everyone time. "I'm not what you'd call a marriageable woman, Mr. Mercer. I know how these arrangements sometimes go. Woman comes out to a ranch, someone starts thinking about practical solutions to practical problems. I'm not available for that." Something shifted in his face. Not offense. More like recognition, maybe. Like she'd named something he hadn't expected her to name. "I'm not looking for a wife," he said. "I'm looking for someone who can feed 14 hungry men through a Colorado winter without walking out when it gets hard." "No man marries a woman shaped like me," Mara said, and she said it without self-pity, just as a statement of fact, the way you'd tell someone the sky was gray today. "But I can feed people. I'm good at it. Maybe the best at it you're going to find in this valley." Rhett Mercer was quiet for 3 full seconds. "That's exactly what I need," he said. She asked him for a day to think about it. He said that was fine and left. She spent that evening doing what she always did when she needed to think clearly. She cooked. She made a full pot of the venison soup, cut the bread she'd baked for herself, and sat at her table alone eating slowly while the wind picked up outside and rattled the shutters. She tried to think about it practically, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. $20 a month was more than she'd see from her current work. A room of her own in the main house meant she'd be warmer than she was in this cabin, where the eastern wall leaked cold air through a gap she'd been meaning to properly fix for 2 years. The work itself, cooking for 14 men, was harder than cooking for the occasional customer, but it wasn't a different kind of work. It was just more of it. She knew how to scale a recipe. She knew how to feed a crowd. The men would be rough. They would probably be rude. They might say things about her that were unkind. Men like that usually did, when they thought you couldn't hear, and sometimes when they knew you could. That part she turned over a few times in her mind, the way you press on a bruise to see if it still hurts. It did still hurt, that was the honest answer. But she had hurt before and kept going. That was also the honest answer. She washed her bowl and spoon, banked the fire, and went to bed. In the morning, she packed a bag. But Mercer Ridge Ranch, November 14th, 1879. The ranch was bigger than she'd imagined from 9 miles away. Rhett came to collect her himself in a buckboard wagon, which she noticed he could have sent a hand, but he drove out himself in the early morning cold and helped load her 2 bags into the wagon bed without making a thing of it. The road out of Black Hollow toward Mercer Ridge wound northeast through a stretch of scrub pine and then broke open into the valley proper, and as they crested the last rise, Mara saw the layout of the place all at once. The main house, 2-storied and solidly built, not fancy but permanent. The long, low line of the bunkhouse. 3 barns in varying sizes, pens and paddocks spreading back toward the ridge, a frozen creek visible in the middle distance. It was a working place. You could see it in the way everything was positioned for function rather than appearance, the way the paths between buildings were worn to mud that had frozen hard, the way the fencing was maintained but not painted, the way the woodpile behind the main house was stacked with the serious efficiency of people who understood what running out of firewood in February meant. "How long have you been running it yourself?" she asked. Rhett glanced at her. 4 years since my father passed." He looked back at the road. "It was doing better 4 years ago." She didn't ask what had changed. That was the kind of thing a person told you when they were ready to tell you, not before. He pulled the wagon up to the main house and got down to help her with the bags. As he lifted the heavier one from the wagon bed, the bunkhouse door opened and 3 men came out to see what the commotion was. Mara had dealt with men who looked at her the way these men looked at her. She recognized it immediately. The assessment, the conclusion, the specific flavor of amusement that wasn't quite laughter, but was getting there. The tallest one, blonde and lean, said something quietly to the one beside him. The other one grinned. Rhett either didn't hear it or pretended not to. He carried her bag toward the house. Mara picked up the second one herself and followed. The kitchen was the center of the main house, a large room that ran the full width of the back, with a big iron cook stove, a long work table, shelves of cookware, and a cold pantry accessible through a low door in the back wall. It smelled of smoke and old grease, and the specific staleness of a room that had been used without care for too long. The previous cook, or whoever had been making the meals since the last woman left, had not been cleaning properly. Mara could see it immediately. The stovetop had a layer of old grease. The shelves were disordered. There were mouse droppings in the corner near the flour sack, and the flour sack itself was tied wrong and had gone slightly damp. She set her bag down. "The pantry situation," she said. "That flour's no good." "I know," Rhett said. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her take inventory of the room. "I should have had someone. I'll need a list of what's in store and what's coming in, and I'll need to know what the men won't eat." He blinked. "What they won't eat?" "Everybody's got something. Allergies or just things that make a grown man act like a child. Better to know it up front than find out when half your crew refuses to come to the table." He was quiet for a second, and then he almost smiled. "Calhoun, the big one with the red beard, he doesn't eat anything with onion. Says it tears him up. What about the rest?" "I'll ask." "I'll ask," she said. "I'd rather hear it from them myself." He raised an eyebrow. "I'm not hiding in this kitchen," she said, and she said it the way she'd said everything else. Flat and clear. Not aggressive, not apologetic. Just the truth of it. If I'm going to feed these men for the next 5 months, I want to know who they are. It helps me cook better. Rhett looked at her for a moment in a way she couldn't quite read. "All right," he said. She met them at supper. There were 14 of them. She'd been told 14, but she counted as they filed into the bunkhouse where meals were served at 2 long tables. 14 men who'd been working cattle and fence and building repair in 20-degree weather all day, who were cold and tired and hungry, and who looked at the new cook with the particular brand of skepticism that men of a certain type reserve for things that don't fit their expectations. She had made biscuits, a beef and potato stew, and a dried apple cobbler for dessert. Simple food. She hadn't tried to impress them, she'd tried to feed them, which was different. The blonde one who'd grinned that morning, She'd learned his name was Dix Holloway, one of the senior hands, sat down, looked at his bowl, and looked up at her where she stood near the serving table. "That it?" he said. "That's the start," she said. "Cobbler's on the back table. Help yourself when you're done." Didn't ask about cobbler, asked if that's the portion. "The pot's full. Take more when you need it." He stared at her for another moment. She didn't look away. He picked up his spoon. The man with the red beard, Calhoun, she remembered, was at the other table. She'd made his portion without the onion she'd put in the base and set it aside, having cooked it separately. She brought it to him now. He looked up at her, confused. "What's this?" "No onion," she said. "Mr. Mercer mentioned you had trouble with it." Calhoun stared at the bowl. He was a big man, somewhere north of 40, with the kind of permanent squint that came from decades of working in sun and wind. He'd said exactly 3 words to her when she'd been introduced to the crew that afternoon. "You the cook?" "Huh?" he said. That was all. She went back to her table and started cleaning. She listened to them eat, listened to the sound of the room, the clank of spoons on bowls, the low rumble of conversation, the occasional laugh. The sounds of a bunkhouse that had been missing something and didn't quite know it. From the far table she heard Dix Holloway say, "Low, but not low enough." Not bad. She allowed herself one small private thing. She kept her face completely still. What's? The first 2 weeks were not easy. The men were rough with her in the low-grade way that doesn't quite constitute an offense. Comments that faded just before she turned around. Humor that existed in the space between her and the room. A kind of constant low-volume dismissal that she recognized from having lived in Black Hollow for 31 years. She was being tested. She understood that. She didn't particularly like it, but she understood it. She responded the only way she knew how to respond. She worked harder. She was up at 4:30 every morning to start the breakfast fire and have biscuits or cornbread going before 5. Lunch was ready when the men came in from morning work. Supper was on the table by 6. She kept the kitchen clean with a discipline that bordered on obsession, because a dirty kitchen made her anxious in a way she couldn't entirely explain and had long since stopped trying to. She used what was in the pantry intelligently, stretching the dried goods and the smoked meat and the root vegetables through careful planning. And when Rhett went to Black Hollow for supplies, she gave him a written list, a real list, itemized and prioritized, that made him stare at it for a moment before he folded it and put it in his coat pocket without comment. She started learning the men, not in a soft way. She wasn't soft, and they'd have rejected softness from her anyway, recognizing it as something false. But she noticed things. She noticed that a young hand named Casper, maybe 19 years old with ears too big for his face, always sat at the end of the table and ate fast with his head down, and that when the other men were loud and laughing, he got very quiet. She noticed that one of the older cowboys, Delmar, they called him, a weathered Mexican man in his 50s who spoke little English and a lot with his hands, always took his coffee to the window and stood looking out at the mountains for 10 minutes after breakfast before he started his day, like he was checking on something. She noticed that Dix Holloway, who was the loudest and the most pointed in his humor, always cleaned his own plate and bowl before he left the table, every time, without being asked. People were not simple. Even simple-seeming people were not simple, once you paid attention. She started adjusting things, small things. She started putting extra cornbread on the table because she'd noticed Casper went back for seconds and thirds, but waited until other people had taken theirs first, which meant he sometimes went without. She started having Delmar's coffee ready and strong before anyone else had theirs, because she figured a man who'd been awake worrying about mountains deserved the first cup. She started making sure the cobbler or the pie she rotated through what she could manage with the available supplies, was on the back table before supper ended rather than after, because she'd noticed the men who stayed to eat dessert were more likely to sit together longer, talking, and the room was better when that happened. None of this was strategy. She didn't plan it out. It was just how she cooked, through observation, through paying attention, through the understanding that feeding people wasn't just about the food. The mocking didn't stop entirely, but it changed character. It became less pointed and more habitual. Like something people kept doing, not because it meant anything, but because they'd started and didn't quite know how to stop. Rhett noticed. She could tell, though he said nothing about it. He had a way of watching the room at supper from his seat at the head of the main house table. She ate separately from the crew, which had been the arrangement when she arrived and which she hadn't argued with. That was careful and quiet, like a man cataloging things he might need later. He thanked her once, about 10 days in, coming through the kitchen while she was washing the supper dishes. He stopped in the doorway. "The men are eating better," he said. "They're eating enough," she said. "That's different." "Is it?" "A man can eat full and still not eat well." She rinsed a cast iron pan and set it on the rack. Being fed properly, having someone think about what they need, not just what's available, that changes something, even if they don't know it's changed. Rhett was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" he asked. "My mother," she said. "And then, when she was gone, myself." She dried her hands on her apron. "And hunger. Hunger teaches you a lot about food if you let it." He nodded slowly, like she'd said something he'd been trying to say himself and hadn't found the words for. "Good night, Miss Whitlock." "Good night, Mr. Mercer." Yet. The blizzard came on a Thursday. They'd had warning, 2 days of dropping pressure and a specific kind of stillness in the air that the older hands recognized and the younger ones were learning to recognize. And they'd spent Wednesday getting the cattle as close in as possible and double-checking the barn doors and bringing in extra wood and doing the 100 small things you do to prepare for something you can't stop. By Thursday morning, the world had disappeared. Mara stayed in the kitchen, which was what she was supposed to do. There was no reason for her to go outside in a blizzard. She had provisions, the fire was banked, and the men were in from the cattle work because you didn't work cattle in conditions where you couldn't see 3 feet in front of you. The bunkhouse was full. The main house was warm. She was making bread and trying not to think about the wind, which had reached a register she hadn't heard before. Not just loud, but aggressive, purposeful sounding, like it wanted something specific from the world and was demanding it. At around 2 in the afternoon, Casper came running into the kitchen. He was still in his coat, snow-covered, out of breath. His ears were red from cold. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "Rhett's asking if you've seen anyone. There's a kid, little girl. Belongs to the Delaney homestead about a mile west. Her father came looking. She went out to the barn to check on the animals and—" Mara was already moving. She stopped, registered what she was doing, and forced herself to stand still for 2 seconds to think. Going out in a blizzard was different from going out in bad weather. Going out in a blizzard without knowing exactly where you were going and exactly how to get back was how you died. She knew this. She also knew that the Delaney homestead was a mile west, which meant there was a path, a fence line, that ran from the western edge of Mercer Ridge's property to the edge of the Delaney claim. She'd seen it. She'd noted it, the way she noted things, because fence lines in blizzards were the only reliable navigation. "Where's Rhett?" she said. "Out front. He's going with 2 of the hands." "I'm going too," she said. "Miss Whitlock, you can't—" "Get me a rope," she said, "long one. And get Mr. Mercer." Casper looked at her for a moment in that particular way that young people look at adults who are doing something alarming, and then he turned and ran. Rhett's face when she appeared on the porch in her coat was complicated. She couldn't read all of it. Part of it was alarm. Part of it was something else. "You're not coming," he said. "I know where the fence line is," she said. "Do any of you?" Dix Holloway, who was standing beside Rhett with a rope already in his hand, said, "West property line? There's a drainage ditch between here and it, about 30 yards in," Mara said. "Runs north to south. If you hit it wrong in this visibility, you could break an ankle." Rhett looked at her. "How do you know that?" Dix said. "Because I walked the western fence 2 weeks ago when I was looking for the root cellar Mr. Mercer told me was out there." She met Rhett's eyes. "I know where I'm going. I can lead you to the line." Rhett was quiet for 3 seconds. "Stay on my left," he said. "Don't let go of the rope." Assent. What followed was not heroic in the way that stories sometimes make things heroic. It was cold and terrifying and physically brutal. The wind hit her like a wall every step, and the snow was not the soft kind. It was hard-driven and stinging. And in the 30 seconds it took to step off the porch and into it, she went from being able to see the barn to being able to see nothing. Absolutely nothing. Just white in every direction, and the pressure of Rhett's arm on her left and the rope in her gloved hand. She counted her steps. She'd walked that ground 2 weeks ago in clear weather, and she knew it. 34 steps to the edge of the yard, Then the ground dropped slightly, then 12 more steps to where the drainage ditch ran, then angle left 15 degrees and follow the slight rise of the ground until you hit the fence post. She found the fence post. She couldn't feel her hands anymore, but she found the fence post and she told Rhett, and felt his grip tighten on her arm in what might have been surprise. They followed the fence line west. The little girl, she was 7 years old, they found out later, her name was Petra, had made it about a third of the way from the Delaney barn back to the homestead house before she'd gotten turned around in the white and sat down on what she thought was the ground and was actually a slight rise above a shallow creek bed. She was covered in snow and not responsive when Rhett got to her, and for 30 seconds the world was very quiet inside all that noise. Then she cried. Mara didn't cry until they were back inside the ranch kitchen with the child wrapped in blankets and pressed against the stove, drinking warm broth that Mara had made her drink by spooning it in herself, small spoonful by small spoonful, until some color came back into the little girl's face and her hand stopped shaking. Then Mara went to the cold pantry, closed the door behind her, stood in the dark, and shook for about 2 minutes. Then she washed her face and went back out and made supper. Papi, the men were different after that. Not transformed. She wasn't a story, and people aren't transformed by single events the way stories sometimes want them to be, but different in the way that real change happens, quietly, incrementally, in the small adjustments of behavior that people make when something has shifted in how they see a person. Dix Holloway stopped with the under-the-breath comments. Not formally, not as an announcement, he just stopped. Calhoun started saying thank you for his meals, which he hadn't done before. Casper, the young one, started helping her carry things from the cold pantry without being asked, and she let him because it seemed important to him. And Rhett started being there in the morning, not intrusively, not in a way that required her to do anything with it. But he took to coming through the kitchen before 5 sometimes, on his way to start whatever needed starting on the ranch. And sometimes he'd stop and have a cup of coffee and they'd talk about the supplies, about the weather, about the cattle situation, about whatever needed to be talked about practically. And sometimes not about anything practical at all. "You're from Black Hollow originally?" he asked one morning. The sky outside was still dark but turning. "Born there," she said. "Haven't been far from it." "You ever want to be?" She considered it. "I wanted to be a lot of things when I was younger. I wanted to see the ocean. I wanted to learn to play an instrument. The piano, I think. I had a whole list." "What happened to the list?" "Life," she said. "Nothing dramatic, just the way things narrow when they're happening to you, without you particularly deciding they should." She poured his coffee. "What about you? You always want to run a ranch?" He wrapped both hands around the mug. "My father wanted me to. I went along with it because—" He stopped, started again. "I was good at it, and I thought being good at something was the same as wanting it." He looked out the window. "I'm not sure those are the same thing." "They're not," she said. "But sometimes you learn to want the thing you're good at, if you do it long enough." He looked at her. "Have you?" he asked. She thought about it. "Cooking?" "Yeah," she said. "I think I have." She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that cooking had become the only place she'd ever been entirely herself. The only context in which her body, her mind, her specific way of paying attention to people and to things were not a liability, but an asset. The only place the world didn't require her to be different than she was. She didn't say that, but she thought it while she refilled his coffee, and some part of it must have been visible in her face, because Rhett Mercer was quiet for a moment after he looked at her, in the thoughtful way of someone who has just seen something they want to remember. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to come up over the ridge. By late December, Mercer Ridge was different from the ranch Mara had arrived at 6 weeks earlier. Not fixed. There were still problems, still tensions, still the grinding financial pressure that Rhett hadn't exactly explained, but that she could see in the careful way he ordered supplies, and the one evening she'd overheard him at the table in his office with a ledger book and a look on his face that she knew well from looking in her own mirror. But the kitchen was the center of something now. She hadn't planned that. She'd just cooked well and paid attention and shown up every morning before anyone else, and somehow the kitchen had become the warmest room in more than one sense, and the men found reasons to be in it or near it in ways they hadn't before. Even Dix Holloway came in one afternoon under the pretense of needing a pot he couldn't find anywhere, and ended up sitting on the stool near the back door eating the heel of a loaf she'd just pulled from the oven, telling her, unprompted, about the town in Kansas he'd come from and the sister he hadn't seen in 4 years. She listened. She cut him another slice of bread. She didn't know what to call what was happening on this ranch. She didn't have language for it yet. She only knew that she woke up each morning wanting to be in that kitchen, which was something she hadn't felt about anything in a very long time. And across the main house, in the quiet of an office with a ledger book he kept going back to, Rhett Mercer was beginning to understand that the most valuable thing on his property couldn't be measured in cattle or acreage or winter feed. He just wasn't sure yet what to do with that understanding. But he was getting there. January came in hard and stayed that way. The cold that settled over Mercer Ridge in the first week of the new year was a different animal from the blizzard cold of November. Less dramatic, more patient, the kind that didn't announce itself but simply sat down on the land and refused to move. The creek froze solid. The cattle needed breaking ice twice a day just to drink. The horses stood with their tails to the wind and their heads down in the paddocks, burning through feed at a rate that made Rhett's jaw tighten every time he looked at the supply numbers. Mara noticed the jaw. She noticed most things. She started stretching the meals differently. Not less food, never less food, because men doing physical labor in sub-zero temperatures needed every calorie they could get, but smarter food. More fat, more density. She rendered lard from the salt pork and used it in everything. She made bone broth from every scrap of bone and put it in the bread dough, in the stew base, in the cornbread batter. She started making a hot grain porridge in the mornings with dried fruit and molasses that the men initially made faces at and within a week were arriving early to be sure they got enough of. "That stuff you makes in the mornings?" Dix Holloway said one day, dropping his empty bowl on the table with a sound that wasn't quite a compliment but was heading in that direction. "What is it?" "Oats and rye with dried apple," she said, wiping down the work table. "And lard." He made a face. "Lard. You want to stay warm, you need fat. You want energy for the afternoon when the temperature drops again. You need the grain. You want to not feel like you're eating paste, you need the apple and the molasses." She looked at him. "You've been eating it every morning for 2 weeks. He opened his mouth, closed it. "I didn't say it was bad." "You made a face." "I make faces." "It's a thing I do." He picked up his hat from the bench. "It's fine. It's fine." He walked out. She could hear from the yard Casper laughing at something Dix said, and then a sound that might have been Dix telling him to shut up, and then more laughing. Fine, she thought. Fine was how it always started. The thing about earning ground with men like these was that you didn't earn it all at once. You earned it the way you earned anything worth having. Incrementally, without announcement, in the accumulation of small moments that only became visible in hindsight. Mara had understood this since she was young, since she'd first figured out that no one was going to hand her anything simply because she deserved it, and that the only currency she'd ever reliably had was the quality of her work and the consistency of her presence. So she stayed consistent. She was there every morning before anyone else. She was there every evening after everyone else had gone. She did not complain about the hours or the cold that crept under the kitchen door, no matter how many rags she stuffed against the gap, or the fact that the pantry shelf had developed a lean that made the jars of preserved vegetables wobble every time you opened the back door with any force. She fixed the shelf herself one afternoon with a piece of scrap lumber and a hammer she found in the barn, because it was easier to fix it herself than to put it on someone's list. Casper found her doing it. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her hammer a nail with the efficient economy of someone who'd done this before, and then he said, "You want me to—" "I've got it," she said. "I know you've got it," he said. "I was going to say, there's a better piece of lumber in the third barn if you want it. Thicker. That one's going to warp." She stopped hammering, looked at the lumber she'd found, looked at him. "Show me," she said. They walked to the third barn in companionable silence, or near enough to companionable, given that companionable wasn't quite the right word for her and Casper, who were still in the stage of being cautious around each other, the way two wary animals are cautious, not out of hostility, but out of a shared understanding that trust was something you built carefully, or not at all. He found the piece of lumber, which was indeed better, a solid oak board, barely used, and carried it back to the kitchen for her without making anything of it, and she let him help her fit it. And when they were done, he went back to whatever he'd been doing before without ceremony. She thought about that for a while afterward. How easy it had been, once she'd let it. How much harder she'd been making things by insisting on doing everything alone, as if asking for help was the same as admitting defeat. She was 31 years old and still learning that lesson. She suspected she'd be learning it at 60. Rhett came to her one afternoon in the second week of January with the ledger book under his arm and a look on his face she'd come to recognize as the one he wore when he was about to say something difficult. "Sit down," she said before he could say anything. He looked at the kitchen chairs. "I'm fine standing." "You've been standing since 4 this morning. Sit down." He sat. She put coffee in front of him. She'd kept a pot warm. She always kept a pot warm because you never knew when someone was going to need it. And she sat across from him with her own cup and waited. He opened the ledger book. She didn't look at the numbers. That felt like an intrusion. But she could see from his face what kind of numbers they were. "I need to cut the crew," he said. "After spring drive, I can keep everyone. But through February and March, I can't justify the payroll the way the cattle numbers are sitting right now." He looked at the table, not at her. "I'm thinking 3 men. Maybe 4. "Who?" "That's the—" He stopped, started over. "That's the part that's sitting wrong with me. All of them are good men." "Who do you need most?" she said. "Practically. Not who do you feel worst about cutting. Who do you actually need to keep the operation functional?" He looked at her then, and there was something in his face that was almost grateful. Not for the answer, but for the question being asked plainly, without flinching from it. They talked through it for an hour. She didn't pretend to know cattle operations better than she knew them. She wasn't a rancher. She was a cook. And she was honest about the limits of what she understood. But she'd been listening for 2 months, and she'd absorbed more than people usually assumed a woman in a kitchen absorbed. She knew which men were multi-skilled and which were specialists. She knew from their own conversations at the supper table which ones had somewhere else to go if they needed to, and which ones were, depending on this payroll, with the particular desperation of men who had nothing waiting behind them. "Casper," she said. "Keep Casper." Rhett frowned. "He's the youngest, the least experienced. He's the hardest worker on this property, and the only one who's figured out on his own what needs doing without being told. You keep him." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "And Delmar. Delmar can do the work of 2 men, and he does it without complaining and without creating problems. You'd be a fool to let Delmar go." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "You've been paying attention." "That's what I do," she said. It came out more tired than she meant it to, and she saw him notice that. She pressed on. "The other 2, you know better than I do, but those 2, Casper and Delmar, those 2 you keep." He closed the ledger. "All right. It's your ranch, Mr. Mercer." "Rhett," he said. It was the 3rd time he'd said it, and each time she'd not quite picked it up, slipping back into the formality the way you slip back into an old habit. "Just Rhett. We've been through a blizzard together. That's usually past the Mr. stage." She almost smiled. "All right," she said. "Rhett." He picked up his coffee cup. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pressing against the kitchen windows with its usual persistence. "You ever regret coming out here?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said, which surprises me a little. "Why's that?" "Because I usually regret things," she said. "It's something of a habit." He didn't laugh, which she appreciated. He just nodded, like he understood that about himself too. The conversation about cutting the crew happened at the end of January. 3 men left. Not Casper, not Delmar. And the ranch contracted into itself the way things do in the deep belly of winter, pulling in close and getting quiet. The remaining hands worked longer hours and complained about it with the resigned efficiency of people who understood that complaining was allowed as long as the work still got done. Mara fed them better for it. She figured if they were going to work longer, the food could pull a little extra weight. It was during this contracted, quiet time that something started shifting between her and the men that she still didn't have entirely the right language for. It wasn't friendship, or not exactly. It was something more like mutual recognition. The specific thing that happens when you've been through hard conditions with people and discovered, to your own surprise, that you're all still standing. Dix Holloway came to her one evening while she was cleaning up after supper and asked her, almost casually, if she knew anything about headaches. She looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe in his off-duty posture, coat off, hat off, Just a man in his flannel shirt with the kind of tension around his eyes that had been there for a while and that she'd noticed but hadn't commented on. "How long?" she said. He shrugged. "Weeks. They come at night mostly, sometimes in the morning." "Where?" He touched the back of his head, low, just above the neck. She set down the dish she was drying. "Come sit." He looked alarmed. I'm not doing anything alarming. Come sit." He sat, reluctantly, on the stool near the window. She went to her personal bag in the corner of the kitchen. She kept it there, out of the way, the small kit of things she'd brought from her cabin that were hers, and found the small cloth pouch of dried willow bark she kept for herself, for the joints that ached in winter and had since she was 28. "This is willow bark," she said, measuring some into a cup. "You make a tea with it, steep it 10 minutes. It won't fix the problem, but it'll take the edge off." She put the water on. "Are you sleeping?" "Some." "How much is some?" He was quiet. "Dicks." 3-4 hours, he muttered. "Maybe." She looked at him for a long moment. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, which told her something about him she hadn't known before. "What's keeping you up?" He shook his head. That meant he wasn't going to say. She didn't push. She wasn't that kind of person. She'd never been the type to pry open a thing that someone had decided to keep closed. "The tea twice a day," she said. "I have enough for 2 weeks. After that, you'll need to get it from the apothecary in Black Hollow when someone's going in for supplies." He looked at the cup she put in front of him with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're not going to tell me to see the doctor," he said. "I don't know that a doctor can tell you anything I haven't just told you," she said. "But if it gets worse, or if you start seeing things strange at the edges of your vision, then yes, you go to the doctor." He picked up the cup, held it. "Why are you doing this?" She went back to drying dishes. "Because you work hard and you haven't been sleeping, and someone should have noticed before now." She didn't say it unkindly. She just said it. "Drink it while it's hot." He drank it. He didn't say thank you. He wasn't quite there yet, and she didn't need him to be. But he came back the next evening for the second cup, and the evening after that, and sometime around the 4th day he started sleeping better, which she knew because he stopped looking like a man being quietly pressed to death from the inside. He never brought it up again. But something settled in him toward her after that, some last piece of resistance going quiet, like a door that had been slightly ajar finally finding its frame. By February, Calhoun was showing her his hands without being asked. He had a problem with his right hand, an old injury from years back, 2 fingers that had been broken badly and set imperfectly, which in cold weather caused him a pain that he had apparently been dealing with for so long, he'd stopped thinking of it as something worth mentioning to anyone. He showed her because she'd noticed him favoring it one morning at breakfast and said nothing about it for 3 days. Just quietly started leaving a bowl of warm, salted water on the back shelf near the stove every morning before he came in, with a small cloth beside it. On the 4th morning, he'd stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the bowl. "That for me?" he said. "The salt draws some of the inflammation," she said, not looking up from the bread she was shaping. 10 minutes, as warm as you can stand it, before you go out." He stood there for another moment. Then he crossed the kitchen, sat down on the stool that had become, without formal designation, the place people sat when they needed something in this kitchen, and put his hand in the water. He sat there for 10 minutes in silence. She worked around him without comment. After the 4th day, it became routine. He came in before the others, soaked his hand, and they existed in the same space without requiring anything of each other, which turned out to be the most comfortable kind of company, the kind where you don't have to perform or explain yourself, where you can just be a person with a problem being helped by another person who doesn't make it into more than it is. "My wife used to do this," he said one morning, out of nowhere, without preamble, the way men who rarely talk sometimes say things, all at once, because they've been holding the weight of it so long they can't hold it anymore. Mara didn't stop what she was doing. "She sounds like she knew what she was doing." "She did." He was quiet for a moment. "She's been gone 11 years. I'm sorry." "Yeah." He lifted his hand out of the water, looked at the 2 crooked fingers. "You'd have liked her," he said. "She was practical, like you." It wasn't a compliment he'd planned. She could tell by the way he looked slightly surprised at himself after he said it, but it landed somewhere real in her, something she didn't entirely know what to do with, and she turned back to her bread so he wouldn't see her face while she figured it out. Practical. Like you. She'd been called worse things. She'd been called worse things in this very county by people who'd known her longer. There was something about having it said by a man who'd spent 6 weeks being openly dismissive of her, said now in the context of comparing her to a woman he'd clearly loved and missed for 11 years. There was something in that she couldn't quite set aside. She thought about it while she shaped the loaves, pressing the dough with her rough hands, and she realized what it was. It was the first time in longer than she could easily remember that someone had compared her to another person, not as a contrast, not as a way of saying what she wasn't, but as a way of saying what she was. Outside the kitchen window, the February sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind was doing its usual work against the walls. But the kitchen was warm. It had been warm for weeks now, and not just from the stove. Mara finished shaping her loaves and slid them into the oven and checked the clock on the wall. 45 minutes. She had 45 minutes before she needed to check on them, which meant she had 45 minutes to start the noon meal, which was a salt pork and bean soup she'd been building since 6 this morning, and to pull together the dried fruit she'd been soaking for the afternoon cake she'd planned, because it was Delmar's birthday. She'd found out from Casper, who'd found out from Delmar accidentally, and she'd decided that a man who'd been on this ranch for 11 years and never once been given a birthday cake deserved one. She hadn't told anyone she was making it. She didn't need the credit. She just needed the cake to be there. That was the part of herself she was still most certain of, in a life where so many other things had been uncertain. She knew how to take care of people. She knew how to see what was needed and provide it, quietly and without theater, without requiring anything in return. She'd done it her whole life, mostly without anyone noticing, and for a long time she'd thought that was the problem, that going unnoticed was the wound she'd never quite healed from. But standing in this kitchen now, with the bread in the oven and the soup on the fire and the fruit soaking for a birthday cake no one knew was coming, she thought maybe she'd had it slightly wrong. Maybe the point had never been to be noticed. Maybe the point had always been this: to be present, to be useful, to make the room a little warmer than it was when you arrived. She was still working out whether that was enough, but it was the most honest answer she had, and she'd always preferred honest answers to comfortable ones. The oven ticked steadily. The soup moved in slow circles in its pot. Through the kitchen window, for the first time in weeks, there was the faintest suggestion of something different in the light. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the memory of it. The idea that the world might eventually turn back toward the sun. Mara noticed it the way she noticed everything. She filed it away and kept working. Spring came to Mercer Ridge the way it always came to high country. Reluctantly, in pieces, 2 warm days followed by a cold snap that reminded you not to trust anything yet. The creek broke up in the 3rd week of March, which Delmar said was earlier than usual, and the cattle started moving differently, restless in the way of animals that could smell the season turning before any person could. Mara had been on the ranch 4 months. She knew this because she'd been paid 4 times. Rhett left the money in an envelope on the kitchen work table on the 1st of each month, always exact, always without ceremony, which she respected. And because she'd started to know the rhythms of this place the way you know the rhythms of your own body. Which boards in the main house floor creaked and when. Which direction the wind came from before a storm. How long the bread needed in the oven when the temperature outside dropped below 20 degrees. Because the cold affected the stove's draw through the chimney in a way that added 7 minutes to every bake time if you didn't account for it. She knew Casper couldn't sleep through thunder and that he tried very hard to pretend otherwise. She knew Delmar prayed in Spanish quietly in the barn each morning, lips moving, head bowed over whatever work his hands were doing, and that it was the most private thing about him, and she treated it as such by simply never being in the barn that early. She knew Dix Holloway's headaches came back when he was worried about something and went away when whatever he was worried about resolved itself, which told her the headaches were anxiety wearing a physical disguise, though she had no intention of saying that to him directly. She knew Rhett Mercer drank 1 glass of whiskey every evening after the men had gone in, sitting on the porch even in cold weather, and that he stopped at 1 glass every time, which told her something about his relationship with restraint that she found quietly reassuring. She knew all of this the way she knew her kitchen, through daily proximity, through attention, through the accumulation of ordinary moments. And the knowing had settled into something she hadn't expected when she'd packed her bag back in November. She belonged here. Not in a grand or permanent sense, not in a way she'd have been able to explain to anyone who asked, but in the practical, daily sense of a person whose presence had become woven into the functioning of a place. She was thinking about this on a Tuesday morning in late March, when Casper came in from Black Hollow, looking the way he looked when he had something to say that he wasn't sure how to say. She was at the work table rolling pie crust. She didn't look up. "What is it?" "Nothing," he said, which meant something. He sat on his stool and picked at a loose thread on his cuff. "Casper." "Vivian Hale is back in town," he said. He said it fast, like pulling a splinter. Mara's hands kept moving on the dough. She knew the name. She'd heard it in pieces. The way you hear things in a small place where everyone knows everyone's history and nobody can quite help themselves from sharing it. Vivian Hale, née Carver, whose father owned the Carver Trading Company out of Denver. Who'd been courting Rhett Mercer, or been courted by him, depending on which version you got, several years back, before something had happened that nobody explained directly, but everyone seemed to have an opinion about. Who'd left for Denver and, by the general account of Black Hollow's more talkative citizens, had not been missed by anyone at Mercer Ridge. "All right," Mara said. "She was at the general store," Casper said, "asking about the ranch." He paused. "Asking about you." That did make her hand stop, just for a second. Then she kept rolling. "What kind of asking?" He was quiet in the way that meant the asking had not been kind. "It doesn't matter," she said, before he could figure out how to say it. "Mara, it doesn't matter what a woman I've never met said about me in a general store, Casper. Go wash up for lunch." He went, but he left the discomfort behind him in the room, hanging in the air like wood smoke. Mara finished the pie crust, fitted it into the pan, and started on the filling. She worked methodically, the way she always worked when something had unsettled her. Not to avoid thinking about it, but because the work gave her hands something to do while her mind did what it needed to do. She'd known, in the abstract, that this was possible. That Rhett had a history she wasn't part of. That Black Hollow had opinions about that history. And that her own presence on the ranch, a woman like her, living in the main house, eating meals with the owner, having morning coffee conversations that had become the kind of conversations you looked forward to, would not go unremarked upon by people who felt entitled to remark. She'd known all of this and had chosen not to spend energy worrying about it, because worrying about what people thought of her was an occupation that had never once improved her situation. But knowing something abstractly and having it arrive in the specific form of a real person, asking questions in a general store, were different things, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that. She put the pie in the oven and started on lunch. Vivian Hale came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon, 2 days later. Mara heard the carriage before she saw it, the sound of a well-maintained rig on the road, which was a different sound from the working wagons and horses she'd gotten used to, lighter and faster. She was at the kitchen window trimming the dried stems off a bunch of herbs she'd been hanging since fall, and she looked out and saw the carriage come up the road from the main gate with the particular purposefulness of something that knew exactly where it was going. She kept trimming her herbs. Rhett was out with the cattle. She knew that. She also knew, from the way Casper had been watching the road since morning, that Casper knew that too, and that the timing of the visit might not be entirely coincidental. She heard the carriage stop, heard a woman's voice, not the words, just the register of it, clear and carrying, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard. Heard Dix Holloway's voice answering, the words muffled through the kitchen wall. Then footsteps on the porch. Then the kitchen door opened. Vivian Hale was everything that the word elegant suggested, and a few things it didn't. She was tall, fine-boned, probably 35, but dressed and composed in a way that negotiated aggressively with that number. Her traveling coat was deep green wool with a fur collar, real fur, not the rabbit sort, and her hair was dark and perfectly arranged under a hat that Mara estimated had cost more than she made in a month. She was beautiful in the specific way of women who've been told they're beautiful so consistently and for so long that it's become the organizing principle of their entire self-presentation. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Mara with the careful, evaluating look of someone who'd already decided what they were going to see and was now confirming it. "You must be the cook," she said. Her voice was pleasant. The pleasantness was a choice. "I am," Mara said. She did not stop trimming her herbs. "Can I help you?" "I was hoping to speak with Rhett, Mr. Mercer." She stepped into the kitchen uninvited, which was a statement. She looked around the room in the way that people look at things they're calculating the value of. He's not in? He's with the cattle. I expect him back before supper. I see. Vivian set her small bag on the work table, in the space Mara was using, and began removing her gloves one finger at a time, slowly, in the manner of someone who understood that deliberate movement was a form of authority. I'll wait then, if that's agreeable. It wasn't a question. You can wait in the sitting room, Mara said. Through the hall, first door on the left. Vivian looked at her with the specific expression of a person who's just been told no in a way they weren't expecting. I thought I'd stay here. The kitchen is warm. The sitting room has a fireplace. Casper, Mara called out, raising her voice toward the hall, knowing he was hovering somewhere just out of sight, which he was because he appeared in the doorway within 3 seconds. Would you light the fire in the sitting room for our guest, please? Casper looked between the two women with the expression of a man watching two weather systems interact. Yes, ma'am, he said, and disappeared. Vivian picked up her bag slowly from the work table. Her eyes moved over Mara, not quickly, but with the deliberate thoroughness of an assessment she intended to be felt. Mara kept working. She had the same feeling she'd had with Dix Holloway that first night, and with the crew in those early weeks. The familiar pressure of someone deciding what she was and where she belonged. That low-grade atmospheric cruelty that doesn't need words to communicate itself perfectly. She'd been living under that pressure her entire life. It had not killed her yet. You've been here since November, I hear, Vivian said, still not moving toward the hall. I have. Unusual arrangement, a woman living in the main house. I have my own room, Mara said. Same as any hired cook would. Of course. Vivian smiled. It was a good smile, technically. I only mean Black Hollow talks, you know. Small towns. She said small towns with the affectionate condescension of someone who'd escaped one. People notice these things. People notice whatever they decide to look at, Mara said. She set down the herb stems she'd been trimming and turned to face Vivian directly for the first time since she'd come in. The sitting room is ready when you are. It was a dismissal. Vivian understood it as such. Something moved through her eyes. Not quite anger, but the precursor to it. The temperature dropped before the storm. She went to the sitting room. Mara stood alone in her kitchen and realized her hands had a slight tremor that she hadn't noticed while she was working. She pressed them flat on the work table and breathed for a moment. Then she put a pot of water on for tea. Good tea, the nicer tin she kept for Rhett when he wanted it, and carried it to the sitting room herself. Because whatever she felt about Vivian Hale, you didn't fail in your basic obligations as the person running a household. She set the tea on the side table and left without speaking. Rhett came in at 5. She heard him come through the back way, which was his habit. Through the barn, checking on things, then around the side of the house, and in through the mudroom, where he left his boots and heavy coat. She heard him stop in the mudroom for longer than usual, which meant someone had told him. Casper, probably. Or Dix. He came into the kitchen and looked at her first. She's in the sitting room, Mara said. I know. He stood in the kitchen in his sock feet, hat in his hands again, the same posture he'd had the very first time he came to her cabin door. There was something tired in his face that wasn't just the end of a working day. Did she... He stopped. Was it all right? Fine, Mara said. He looked at her. Fine, she said again. And she said it in a way that meant she knew he knew it hadn't been fine, and that she wasn't going to make him wade through the details of it, because she was not a woman who needed rescuing from conversations. He nodded. I'll go talk to her. She came a long way, Mara said. It cost her something to say it fairly. You should at least have supper with her. He looked at her for a long moment. Mara, it's supper, Rhett. I'll set 2 places in the dining room. He went to the sitting room. She set the dining room places. She made a better supper than she'd planned, a proper roast with the last of the good winter root vegetables, and an apple tart she'd been saving for a particular occasion that this was not. She did it because the food was her responsibility, and she did that responsibility without reference to her feelings, which had always been the only way she knew to do it. She could hear, intermittently, the sound of conversation through the dining room wall while she worked. Not words, just cadence. Vivian's voice smooth and consistent, Rhett's shorter, with gaps. The kind of conversation where one person is making a case and the other is listening without quite agreeing. The crew ate in the bunkhouse. Casper stayed close to the main house, which she also noticed. At 7:15, Vivian came into the kitchen. Mara was washing dishes. She heard the footsteps and knew from the sound, too deliberate, too measured, the footsteps of someone who'd made a decision, that this was not a casual visit. She kept washing. "You should know," Vivian said, and the pleasantness in her voice was entirely gone now, replaced with something that had probably always been underneath it. "That whatever you think is happening here, it isn't. Rhett Mercer is not a man who—" She stopped and chose her next words with the care of someone handling something sharp. "He's grateful to you, for the winter, for keeping things running. But gratitude is not what you're hoping it is." Mara set down the bowl she was washing, dried her hands, turned around. "I don't recall telling you what I was hoping," she said. "You don't have to." Vivian's eyes moved over her again with that same deliberate assessment. "I've seen the way things run here. You've made yourself very necessary. That's a kind of intelligence, I suppose. Making yourself hard to remove." She tilted her head slightly. "But men like Rhett, men with this kind of property, this kind of name, they make particular kinds of choices about who stands beside them, who they're willing to be seen with. You understand that." The kitchen was very quiet. Mara looked at this woman, beautiful, composed, certain of her own position in the world in the specific way of people who've never had cause to doubt it, and felt something move through her that was complicated and layered and not entirely unfamiliar. The familiar ache of it. The old instruction she'd received so many times and in so many different forms. "You are not the kind of woman this is for." "I understand that you've come a long way," Mara said. Her voice was steady. She had a lot of practice keeping her voice steady. "And I understand you have feelings about the situation, but what happens on this ranch isn't your decision, and it isn't mine either. It's Rhett's." She picked up the next dish. "Good night, Miss Hale." Vivian left. Mara heard the carriage depart not 20 minutes later. She finished the dishes. She swept the kitchen floor. She banked the fire and checked the bread for morning and did every small routine thing she did every night, moving through the kitchen in the dark with the efficiency of someone who could do it blind. She was almost done when Rhett came in. He stood in the doorway. He looked like a man who just had a conversation that had required something from him he hadn't expected to give. "She's gone," he said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What did she say to you?" "Nothing that matters." "Mara." She stopped moving. She was standing at the work table with a clean cloth in her hands, and she looked at him, and she was so tired suddenly. Not from the work, not from the day, but from the particular exhaustion of being a person who'd spent her whole life bracing for the moment when the thing she'd allowed herself to value got taken away or proved itself to have never been hers. "She said what people like her always say," Mara said. "That I've made myself useful and I shouldn't confuse that with belonging." She folded the cloth, set it down. "And she's not entirely wrong, so there's not much to argue with." Rhett moved then. Crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, which she registered because he was not a man who moved quickly, and he stopped on the other side of the work table from her close enough that she could see the exact set of his jaw. "She's wrong," he said. "Rhett, she is wrong." He said it with a flatness that wasn't anger exactly, but was the thing that lives next to anger, the controlled version of it. "You are not here because you've made yourself useful. You are here because this place is better with you in it, and I know the difference between those two things." He stopped, looked at the table. "I should have said that before tonight. I should have said it a lot of things before tonight." The kitchen was quiet. Mara looked at this man. Not young, not uncomplicated, not any of the things she'd spent her life being told she should wait for, and felt something shift in her chest in a way she didn't entirely trust yet. "It's late," she said. "Yeah. I need to get the starter going for tomorrow's bread." He looked at her. "Is that a dismissal?" She thought about it. "It's just true," she said. "Both things can be true at once." He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen on him in weeks. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the work table. "Good night, Mara." "Good night, Rhett." He went. She stood in the kitchen for another moment, alone with the cooling stove and the sound of the wind and the weight of the evening pressing on her shoulders. Then she got the starter from the cold shelf, measured out her flour, and began. Outside, the spring was still arriving in its reluctant pieces. But something in the kitchen felt different from what it had felt like in the morning, and Mara Whitlock, who noticed things, noticed this too. She wasn't sure yet what to do with it, but she had bread to make, and the morning would come, and she'd been getting up to face mornings her entire life. She kept working. 3 days after Vivian Hale's carriage left the road to Mercer Ridge, Mara found the first man sick. It was Casper. He came to breakfast looking wrong, not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong you'd catch from across the room, but wrong in the specific way she'd learned to read people, the slight dullness around the eyes, the careful way he moved like his body was a thing he was carrying rather than inhabiting. She put his plate in front of him and watched him look at the food without wanting it, which for Casper was as reliable a warning sign as a thermometer. "How long?" she said quietly, so the others wouldn't hear. "Since yesterday evening." He picked up his fork, set it down. "It's probably nothing. Where does it hurt?" He pressed his hand briefly against his abdomen, high up, just below the ribs. Then he looked at her with the specific expression of a 19-year-old who doesn't want to be the person causing problems. "Go lie down," she said. "I've got fence work this morning. Casper." She said it the way she'd learned to say things to him. Not hard, but not negotiable. "Go lie down." He went. By noon, Delmar had the same look. By supper, 2 more, a hand named Ridley and the younger of the brothers, Tom Garrett, who'd been with the ranch since fall. 4 men in 12 hours, all presenting the same way. The pain in the upper belly, the low fever, the refusal of food. Mara stood in the middle of her kitchen at 8 o'clock that evening and ran through it in her mind. Not fever from cold, not the croup, not anything she'd seen move through men from contact with each other this fast. She went to the cold pantry and stood in the dim light and looked at what they'd eaten in the last 24 hours, what all 4 of them had eaten that the others hadn't, or what all 4 had eaten more of. She went back through the day's meals methodically. Breakfast had been the same for everyone. Lunch, she stopped. The smoked salt pork. She'd opened a new barrel of it at lunch. The old barrel was finished. The new one had come in on the supply wagon from Black Hollow 4 days ago, from a different supplier than usual, because Rhett had mentioned the regular one was short on inventory and he'd had to source elsewhere. She'd used it at lunch. All 4 sick men had had second helpings of the pork, she remembered, because she'd noticed, because she always noticed. She went back to the pantry and found the barrel and got close to it in the bad light and smelled it. It wasn't right. The smell was off in a way that was subtle enough to have missed in the general work of cooking for 15 people. But standing here now, alone, with her nose 2 inches from the brine, it was wrong. Something in the cure was wrong, or the barrel had been compromised before it arrived, or it had sat in conditions it shouldn't have sat in. She found Rhett. He was in his office, which was where he went when he was trying to avoid thinking about the ledger by staring at it. She knocked once and came in without waiting, which she'd never done before, and his face registered the irregularity of it immediately. "The salt pork from the new barrel," she said. "We need to stop serving it." He put the pencil down. "How many?" 4 so far. Casper, Delmar, Ridley, and Tom Garrett. Same symptoms on all of them. Abdominal pain, low fever, no appetite. Started with Casper yesterday evening, which means they're about 18 hours into it. How bad? Not yet critical. But if more men ate from that barrel and I haven't identified everyone who's sick. She stopped. "I need to know who had second helpings at lunch. Can you remember?" He was already standing. "I'll get Dix. He'd know." Dix knew. He always knew who ate what at his table, a kind of automatic inventory that she suspected came from years of hard seasons when knowing how much a man could eat was relevant to knowing how much food you needed. He'd seen Ridley and one other, a hand named Pierce, who Mara hadn't yet added to her list, go back for the pork at lunch. She found Pierce in the bunkhouse already lying down, which answered that question. 5 men. 5 men sick, and the barrel sealed and taken out of the kitchen by Dix and Calhoun and put in the far barn away from everything else. Rhett sent a rider to Black Hollow for the doctor, which was the right call, and which would also take most of the night because Doc Farwell lived on the south side of town and the road between here and there in early spring was soft mud in the low sections, and the rider would have to go careful or lose a horse, which meant until morning it was her. She understood this with a clarity that had no drama in it. She wasn't frightened, or she was frightened, but the fear sat behind the work rather than in front of it, the way it had in the blizzard when she'd counted her steps to the fence post. Fear was allowed to exist as long as it stayed out of the way. She built up the kitchen fire and started water boiling. The thing about food sickness, the specific kind she thought this was, from bad brine in a compromised barrel, was that the body needed two things: to expel whatever was causing the damage, which it would do on its own and violently, and to stay hydrated through the process, which it would resist doing because everything hurt and nothing seemed worth the effort. Dehydration was what killed people, not the sickness itself usually. Keeping fluids in 5 men who didn't want fluids was going to be the work. She made a broth, not a cooking broth, or a medicinal one, the kind her mother had made her understand before she'd understood much else. Bone-based, heavily salted with clean salt, with dried ginger and a small amount of dried yarrow from her personal kit. The yarrow was for the fever. The salt was for the fluid retention. The ginger was for the nausea, which would make everything else harder if she didn't address it. She also made willow bark tea, stronger than what she'd given Dix for his headaches, and sweetened it with molasses because the bitterness of it at this concentration would make a sick man refuse it. And a man who refused medicine was a man who wasn't getting medicine. She carried it to the bunkhouse in 2 pots, Casper holding the door. Casper was the least sick of the 5. He'd had less of the pork than the others, and he'd come out of his bunk when he heard her come in, pale but functional, with that look on his face of someone who wants to help and isn't sure if they're allowed to. "Can you do something useful?" she said. "Yeah," he said immediately, in the voice of a person enormously relieved to be asked. "Then you're my hands tonight. I need someone to help me get these men to drink. You take Delmar and Ridley. I'll take Pierce and Tom. Every half hour. Small amounts, not large. If you give a sick man a large amount, he'll just lose it immediately, and it's a waste." "What about Casper?" He stopped. I know what you mean." She almost smiled despite the evening's circumstances. "You're fine enough, and I need you more out here than lying in that bunk." They worked through the night. It was not, she thought, somewhere around 2 in the morning, standing over Pierce with a cup of broth and a patient she was drawing from somewhere she couldn't quite locate. It was not the worst night she'd ever had. That was a low bar, maybe. But it was honest. Pierce was the most difficult. He was a stubborn man in good health and a spectacularly stubborn man in bad health, and he resisted the broth and the tea and her presence with equal unhappy energy until somewhere around midnight when his fever spiked high enough that the stubbornness went out of him the way air goes out of a bellows. And he lay there with his eyes half open and let her spoon the liquid into him without further argument. Tom Garrett was easier. He was young and frightened and essentially did whatever she said, which was both easier to manage and harder to watch, because frightened young men were a specific kind of difficult to be around when you were also frightened and couldn't show it. Delmar said almost nothing, as was his way, but drank what Casper brought him with a steady, deliberate compliance that she found more comforting than anything else in the room. Rhett came through at midnight and again at 3 in the morning. He didn't interfere. He understood, she thought, that the kitchen was her territory the way the cattle were his, and that the most useful thing a person could do in someone else's territory was stay out of the way and be available when needed. He stood in the bunkhouse doorway each time, assessed the room, looked at her. "How are they?" he said, at 3. "Pierce is the most concerning. His fever's too high." She wiped her hands on her apron. She'd been wearing the same apron for 9 hours, and it showed. "If the doctor's not here by morning, I'm going to need to bring the fever down differently." "What do you need?" "Ice, if there's any left in the ice house. And more willow bark if you have it in the main house stores anywhere. I'm running through mine faster than I expected." He went and found both. The ice house still had a layer of winter ice in the lower section, packed in sawdust, and he brought back a block wrapped in cloth, and she used it on Pierce's neck and wrists and watched the fever begin, slowly and resentfully, to release its grip. At 4:30, she went back to the kitchen to make more broth and stood at the stove while the water heated and realized she was shaking. Not dramatically, just a low continuous tremor through her hands and forearms that she recognized as the product of sustained tension finally looking for an exit. She held the edge of the stove and breathed. She thought about Vivian Hale standing in this kitchen 3 days ago, telling her that she'd made herself useful and shouldn't confuse it for belonging. She thought about that word, useful, and how it had sat in her chest like a coal, dull and hot and persistent. She was useful right now, undeniably, concretely, in the most direct possible sense. 5 men in a bunkhouse were going to be alive in the morning partly because of what she was doing tonight, and that was true regardless of how anyone felt about her or what category they put her in, or whether a beautiful woman from Denver with a fur collar thought she belonged here. She'd belonged in this kitchen since November. She'd known it before anyone else did. That was the truth, and she held on to it while her hands shook over the stove, and after a while the shaking settled. She made the broth. She went back to the bunkhouse. Doc Farwell arrived at 7:15 in the morning, dusty from the road and slightly irritable in the way of a man dragged from sleep for a long ride, and he went through the bunkhouse examining each man with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen this kind of thing before. He found her in the kitchen when he was done. "Food sickness," he said, in a tone that was halfway between confirmation and accusation, looking at her like the cook was an obvious place to assign responsibility. "Compromised salt pork," she said, and she said it evenly. "From a barrel that I've quarantined in the far barn. If you want to look at it, I'll show you." He did look at it. He came back from the barn with a slightly altered expression. "The brine's gone bad," he said. "This happens when the barrel's exposed to temperature extremes during transit or storage," she said. "Yes, the new supplier, apparently." He looked at her properly for the first time. "You've been managing them through the night." "Yes. Fluids. Broth with salt, willow bark tea with ginger and yarrow for the fever and nausea, ice for Pierce when his fever went too high." He was quiet for a moment. "Pierce's fever is down." "I know." "You did that." "Yes." He looked at her with an expression she'd seen before on men who'd underestimated her, and then arrived at a recalibration. Not quite an apology, not quite admiration, but the specific mix of both that people produce when they realize they'd already made up their mind before they had any information. "Carry on," he said, as if he'd been overseeing her all along and was now granting permission to continue. She didn't bother responding to that. She just turned back to the stove. He stayed 2 hours, checked the men twice more, left her a small supply of quinine powder for fever management going forward, and rode back to Black Hollow with the look of a man who'd come to a crisis and found it mostly handled. The men who hadn't been sick came to her one by one through that morning in the scattered, individuated way of people who want to say something but aren't sure of the protocol. Dix Holloway came first. He came into the kitchen at 8 while she was making a plain rice porridge for the sick men, something easy, something the stomach could manage, and he stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary before he spoke. "They're going to be all right," he said, "if they drink what I tell them to drink and rest what I tell them to rest." She stirred the pot. "Yes." He nodded. He stood there another moment. "You've been up all night." "I have. You should sleep." "I will." She kept stirring. "After this is on and someone can watch it." "I'll watch it," he said. She looked at him. "I can watch a pot," he said, with a touch of the old defensiveness that was softer now, worn down to something that was almost self-aware. "Tell me what it needs." She told him. He listened with the focused attention of a man who does not like to be told anything twice, which she had come to understand was actually a form of respect from Dix Holloway. That his listening carefully was as close as he got to saying, "You matter." She went to her room in the main house and lay down on her bed with her boots still on and slept for 4 hours without dreaming. She woke up to the sound of voices in the kitchen below, Dix's and Calhoun's and Rhett's, and the lower rumble of someone she couldn't identify. She lay still for a moment, taking inventory of herself. Her feet ached. Her lower back had the specific deep soreness of too many hours on a stone floor. Her eyes felt like they'd been rinsed in dust. She got up. She came downstairs to find Rhett sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who'd been waiting without wanting to seem like he'd been waiting. Dix and Calhoun were both gone. The porridge pot was clean and hung back on its hook. Someone had swept the kitchen floor, which had not been swept in 2 days. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. "The pot's clean," she said. "Calhoun washed it," Rhett said. Dix swept. They argued about which one was doing what for about 20 minutes before they settled it. He looked at his coffee cup. Casper is sitting with Pierce, Delmar is asleep, Ridley and Tom are drinking the broth you left. She came to the table and sat down, which she'd never done in the middle of the day because there was always something that needed doing, and sitting in the middle of the day felt like a declaration she hadn't earned. But she sat now because her back required it. Rhett got up, poured her a cup of coffee, and put it in front of her. She looked at the cup. In 5 months on this ranch, she had never once been the person coffee was poured for. "Thank you," she said, and it came out rougher than she intended, hoarser from the sleepless night. He sat back down. He looked at her across the kitchen table with that quiet, careful look of his. The one that didn't require anything from her, that simply acknowledged her existence as something worth acknowledging. "Last night," he said, "what you did was what needed doing," she said. "Mara." She looked up. "You saved Pierce's life," he said. "Probably Tom's too. Doc Farwell said as much before he left." He paused. "I need you to hear that." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. The warmth of it went all the way through her cold fingers, and she closed her eyes for a moment without meaning to. "I heard it," she said. "Do you believe it?" She thought about it. About the night, about the shaking at the stove at 4:30 in the morning, about the word useful sitting in her chest like a coal, about the difference between being necessary and belonging, which she'd been turning over for days. "I'm working on it," she said. Rhett nodded slowly, like that was a good enough answer for now. Outside the kitchen window, the spring morning had settled into the clear, cold blue of a high country day, and the light coming in across the work table was the particular pale gold of a season that was finally, genuinely turning. The creek would be running full by now. The first grass would be coming up along the south-facing slopes. Mara drank her coffee. Her hands had stopped shaking. In the bunkhouse, Pierce was sleeping through the worst of it, with Casper in the chair beside him, reading aloud from a dime novel he'd probably borrowed from someone without asking, his voice low and steady, turning the pages with the quiet care of someone who understood that the best thing he could do right now was simply be present. None of it was easy. None of it was without cost. The ranch was still struggling financially. The sick men would need days to recover. The spring work was already behind, and somewhere in Black Hollow there was a barrel of bad salt pork that needed to be traced back to its source before it sickened anyone else. But Mara Whitlock was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee that someone else had poured, in a house that had come to know the weight of her footsteps, and outside the window the land was turning green. She noticed that. She filed it away. And then she got up, set her cup in the wash basin, and went to check on her men. Pierce was on his feet by the 5th day. He came into the kitchen on a Thursday morning, walking carefully, the way a man walks when his body has recently reminded him what it's capable of, and he's decided to take that information seriously going forward. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and Mara looked up from the dough she was working and waited. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't," she said. "Doc Farwell told me." "Doc Farwell talks too much." She shaped the dough into its loaf. "You owe me a full recovery, that's all. Sit down if you need to sit. Go back to bed if you need to go back to bed, and don't eat anything heavy for another 2 days. Pierce stood there for another moment with the expression of a man who'd prepared a speech and had it declined. He was not a soft man. She'd understood that about him since November, the way you understand the nature of a thing by watching it in difficult conditions. He was rough-edged and not particularly interested in other people's feelings, which was not the same as being unkind, though it could look that way from a distance. He walked to the work table and put something down on it, a carved wooden spoon, not new, worn smooth from use, with a small notch near the handle that looked like it had been there a long time. "It was my mother's," he said. "It's the only thing I've got that belonged to her." He looked at the spoon, not at Mara. "I want you to have it." The kitchen was very quiet. Mara looked at the spoon. She thought about what it cost a man like Pierce to do this, not the gesture itself, which was simple enough, but the admission underneath it, the acknowledgement of a debt that couldn't be settled any other way. "Thank you," she said. She picked it up, held it. Pierce nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the bunkhouse without another word. She stood holding the spoon for a long time after he'd gone. It was smooth and warm in her hand, the wood darkened from years of use, and she thought about the woman who'd held it before her, a woman she'd never know, who'd cooked for people she'd never meet, who'd left something behind that had somehow ended up here, in this kitchen, on this particular morning. She set it on the shelf where she could see it while she worked. Then she put her hands back in the dough. The remaining sick men recovered in the days that followed, Delmar last, because he'd been sicker longest, but recovering with the same quiet determination he brought to everything. By the second week of April, all 5 were back to full work, and the ranch resumed its spring rhythm, which was a different rhythm from winter. Faster, louder, with more moving parts and more pressure, and the particular high-strung energy of men who'd been contracted and still and cold for months, and were now finally able to do the full scope of what they were built for. The cattle work expanded. New hands were brought in for the spring drive. 3 men Rhett had worked with before, not strangers, men who slid into the ranch's rhythms with the ease of familiarity. Mara cooked for 17 now, sometimes more when extra help came in for specific tasks, and she did it with the same systematic attention she'd brought to 14 in November, adjusting, adapting, scaling without losing the quality that had made the kitchen what it had become. Something was different about the kitchen by spring, and she wasn't the only one who'd noticed it. The men's wives and families, when they came to visit during the better weather, found reasons to come inside it. Travelers who stopped at Mercer Ridge for water or to rest a horse sometimes stayed for a meal, and left talking about it in a way that Mara heard about secondhand through Casper, who seemed to collect this information specifically because he understood it mattered. The Delaney family, whose daughter Mara had helped find during the November blizzard, came by once a month now, and Petra, the little girl who'd been 7 years old and covered in snow when Mara had last held her against her chest, came running into the kitchen each time like it was a place she'd always belonged. Mara watched her eat a biscuit at the work table one April afternoon, feet dangling from the stool, and thought about the strange journey a person took through their own life, the ways the things you did without thinking became the things that mattered most. It was in early May that Rhett asked to talk to her, not in the passing way of the kitchen doorway conversations they'd been having for 6 months, but formally. He came to her after supper and asked if she'd sit with him on the porch, which was an unusual request, and which she accepted with the wariness of someone who'd been surprised enough times to know that formal requests came with formal things attached to them. They sat in the 2 chairs on the main house porch, the ones that faced west toward the ridge, and the evening light was the long golden kind that late spring produced in this valley, the kind that made everything look more significant than it was, which was either a gift or a trap depending on your disposition. Rhett had his coffee, she had hers. He looked at the ridge for a while before he said anything. "I've been thinking about the kitchen," he said. She waited. "The way it's been this spring. The way people come." He turned the cup in his hands. "Bertie Halloran at the boarding house told me last week that 3 families who've come through Black Hollow this month asked specifically about Mercer Ridge. Not because of the cattle, because they'd heard about the food." Mara looked at her coffee. "Word travels." "It does." He was quiet for another moment. "I've been thinking about what that could be. Whether there's something in it." He stopped, started again with the slightly labored quality of a man who's rehearsed something and is now finding that the rehearsed version doesn't quite fit the actual moment. "There's a building at the south edge of the property. The old grain store. It's been sitting empty for 3 years. It's structurally sound. I had it checked last fall. And it's bigger than it looks from outside." She turned to look at him. "I'm thinking," he said, "about whether it could be made into something else. A proper kitchen and a gathering space. For travelers. For the ranch hands and their families. Maybe, eventually, for people from Black Hollow who'd make the ride." He glanced at her briefly, then back at the ridge. "I'm thinking about whether you'd want to run it." The evening light moved slowly across the valley below the ridge, the way light does in high country. Not fading so much as deepening, the colors becoming more of themselves before the dark came. "Run it," she said. "I'd invest in the building and the initial supplies. The kitchen equipment, whatever you need, proper equipment, not the improvised situation we've been working with all winter." He turned to face her more fully now, and she could see the thing in his face that he'd been getting toward all evening. Not uncertainty exactly, but the particular vulnerability of a person putting something real in front of another person and waiting to see what they do with it. "You'd have a stake in it, not as an employee, as a partner." The words sat between them in the evening air. "Rhett," she said, I know it's not a small thing to ask, He set his coffee cup down on the porch railing. And I know I'm not a man who's particularly good at saying things directly, which is probably apparent, but I'm going to try. He looked at his hands. You've been here 6 months. You came because I needed a cook, and you needed the work, and neither of us was expecting anything beyond that. And somewhere in the middle of the winter, I stopped thinking of you as the cook and started thinking of you as... He stopped. As what? She said. He looked at her. As the person I want to be making decisions with, he said. About this ranch. About what it can be. About... He stopped again, and this time the stopping was different, quieter. About most things, honestly. Mara sat with that for a long moment. She thought about November, the cabin in Black Hollow, the cold, the knock on her door that she'd answered without hope. She thought about the first night in the bunkhouse, the thinly veiled laughter, the particular ache of being in a room full of people who'd already decided what you were. She thought about the blizzard and the fence post, and her hands going numb on the rope. She thought about Vivian Hale standing in this kitchen with her careful smile and her fur collar and the old familiar instruction delivered in a new voice. You are not the kind of woman this is for. She thought about Pierce's mother's spoon on her shelf. She thought about what she'd told Rhett months ago over early morning coffee, that sometimes you learn to want the thing you were good at if you did it long enough. The building at the south edge, she said. How big? Something shifted in his face. 40 feet by 30, high ceiling, 2 good windows on the south wall that get morning light. I'd need a second stove, a proper one, not a compromise. Yes. And storage that's actually dry. The pantry situation in this house has been, I know, yes. And if we're feeding travelers, we need a reliable supply agreement for staple goods, not sourcing from whoever's cheapest that week. That's how you get a bad barrel of salt pork. He almost smiled. I know that too. She looked at the ridge and the long light. She thought about what it meant. Not the business of it, which she could figure out, but the weight of it. What it meant to stop being the person who existed at the edge of things and start being the person at the center of something. What it meant to let someone see you clearly enough to ask you for a partnership, not because you'd made yourself small enough to be acceptable, but because you hadn't. What do you want to call it? She said. I thought I'd leave that to you. She was quiet for a moment. The iron hearth, she said. It came out without much deliberation, which meant it had been sitting somewhere in her for longer than she'd known. Rhett repeated it quietly, like he was testing its weight. The iron hearth. The hearth is what keeps a place alive in winter, she said. Everything gathers around it. It's not decorative. It's not pretty. It's just the thing that keeps the cold out. She paused. That's what I want it to be. Then that's what it'll be, he said. They sat on the porch in the deepening evening and didn't say much else for a while, which was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had asked out loud yet. She understood, and she thought he understood, that they were both people who moved toward things slowly and with difficulty, who had reasons for that slowness that lived in the past and required patience to navigate. That patience, his and hers both, was not a lack of feeling. It was the shape that feeling took in people who'd learned to be careful with it. There would be more conversations. There would have to be. But for now, the evening was enough, and the ridge was turning violet in the last light, and somewhere in the bunkhouse someone was playing a harmonica badly, which meant it was probably Casper, and the sound of it drifted across the yard and up to the porch like something ordinary and irreplaceable. The building work started in late May. Rhett did what he'd said he would do. He put money into it without looking for corners to cut, which surprised her, and also didn't because she'd understood by now that he was a man who, once he'd decided something, committed to it fully. The south building was cleared out and cleaned, the floor was repaired, new shelving was built along the north wall. 2 windows were added on the east side for the afternoon light she requested, and the second stove shut, a proper iron range, the best one that could be sourced from Denver without waiting another 6 weeks, arrived on a freight wagon in the 3rd week of June and took 4 men to carry inside. Mara stood in the middle of the new space after the stove was in and looked at the room. It smelled of new wood and iron and the specific clean emptiness of a space that hasn't been used yet, that hasn't accumulated the particular character of a lived-in place. She thought about how it would smell in a year. Bread and smoke and broth, and the 100 other things that a kitchen absorbed and held onto, the invisible record of everything cooked inside it. She was ready to write that record. Casper found her standing there and leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and said, "You're doing the thing where you're already seeing what it's going to be." "Maybe," she said. "It's a good thing," he said. "You see things before other people do. You always have." She looked at him, this 19-year-old with his two big ears and his relentless, useful presence. And she thought about the boy who'd eaten fast with his head down at the end of the table that first night, waiting to see if there'd be enough left for him. "You're going to need to learn to cook," she said. He looked alarmed. I'm a cattle hand." "You're a cattle hand who's been watching me cook for 7 months. You already know more than you think." She looked back at the room. "I can't run this place alone. I need someone who understands what I'm building here." "I can't, Casper." She turned to look at him directly. "When did you last do something because you couldn't?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "Saturday mornings," she said. "We start Saturday." He learned faster than she expected, which she'd expected. He had the essential quality, the attention. The willingness to watch a thing until he understood it before he tried to do it. He burned things in the early weeks, which was normal, and he oversalted things, which she corrected, and he had a tendency to rush the bread timing because waiting made him anxious, which she was patient about because impatience in a kitchen was something you unlearned over time and not before. But he had good hands and a genuine interest in the people he was cooking for, which was the thing that couldn't be taught if it wasn't already there. The Iron Hearth opened on the 1st of August. It wasn't an event. She hadn't wanted an event. The notion of ceremony around it made her uncomfortable, as if the place needed to justify itself before it had done anything. She simply opened the doors in the morning, put food on, and let whatever was going to happen happen. By noon there were 11 people at the tables who weren't ranch hands, 2 traveling families heading west, a pair of surveyors who'd heard about the place in Black Hollow, 3 men from a neighboring operation who'd ridden over on a pretense Mara found slightly transparent but chose not to comment on. By the end of the first week, the word was moving the way word moved in frontier country, person to person, across the distances between homesteads and settlements, with the specific reliability of information that people have tested themselves and found true. Bertie Halloran from the Black Hollow boarding house came out on a Friday in the second week, sat at one of the long tables, ate a full meal, and said to Mara afterward, "You know, I told Rhett Mercer to come to you because I thought you'd be too stubborn to quit. I didn't know it would turn into this." "Neither did I," Mara said. "Are you happy?" Bertie asked it directly, the way she did most things, with the comfortable intrusiveness of a woman who'd known Mara long enough to feel entitled to direct questions. Mara thought about it, really thought about it, the way you think about questions that deserve more than a reflexive answer. "I'm not done figuring out what happy means for me," she said finally, "but I'm somewhere I want to be at, doing something I want to do, with people I—" She paused. "That's more than I expected to have." "That's more than most people get," Bertie said. "Don't undersell it." She didn't undersell it, but she also didn't overclaim it, because she was not a person who overclaimed things, and she didn't intend to start now. What she had was real and imperfect and ongoing, which was the only kind of thing worth having. Rhett came to her in the kitchen of the Iron Hearth on a Tuesday evening in September, after the last customers had gone and Casper had finished cleaning up and gone back to the ranch, and the place was quiet and smelled of the day's work the way she'd known it would. She was doing a final check of the pantry, the real pantry, dry and organized, with a door that sealed properly, when she heard him come in. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you." He leaned against the pantry doorframe. He'd been doing that more, appearing in doorframes, present without intruding, which she'd come to understand was his version of closeness. A man who'd spent years alone in his own house, learning to exist in a space without pressing on it. "Dick said something to me today," he said. "What did Dick say?" "He said—" Rhett stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. "He said that Mercer Ridge has 2 separate good things happening on it now, and that I'd be a fool not to recognize both of them." She looked at him. "I thought you should know he said it," Rhett said. "Given that last November given where he started." She turned back to the pantry and checked the last shelf. "Dix Holloway had trouble sleeping. He thought that was about headaches. I thought it was about something else." She closed the pantry door. People change when someone takes the time to actually see them. That's all he is. Maybe, Rhett said. Or maybe you're better at people than you give yourself credit for. She looked at him across the kitchen. The evening light through the east window was low and warm, and the room around them was everything she'd built it to be. Not perfect, not finished, but real. A place that breathed. I don't give myself credit, she said. I just do the work. I know, he said. That's part of it. He crossed the kitchen then, not quickly, not with any of the dramatic momentum of a man making a statement. Just crossed the kitchen the way a person crosses towards something they've decided they're not going to wait on anymore. He stopped in front of her and she looked up at him, this man who was tired and not young and had the weight of a struggling ranch in his face and had shown up at her cabin door in a blizzard because he needed someone who'd stay. I'd like to stop pretending I don't have something to say to you, he said. If you're willing to hear it. I've been willing for a while, she said. I just didn't know if you knew it. He looked at her. I knew it. Then say it. He did. He wasn't eloquent about it. He was a man of the frontier and he said it the way such men say important things. Plainly, without decoration, looking directly at her, so there was no possibility of misunderstanding. He said that she was the most capable person he'd known and the most honest, and that somewhere between November and now he'd stopped being able to imagine the ranch, or the kitchen, or mornings, without her in them. He said he understood that she'd spent her whole life being told what she wasn't, and he had no interest in adding to that inventory. He said he was asking her nothing she didn't want to give and everything he had to offer, which wasn't a small thing and wasn't a large thing. It was just his, and he wanted her to have it. She listened. She let him finish. Then she said, You know I'm not going to be easy to live with. I have opinions about everything, and I'll tell you when I think you're wrong, and I will never once pretend to agree with something I don't agree with just to make the room more comfortable. I know, he said. I'm counting on it. She almost laughed. The almost laugh surprised her, the way real laughter sometimes does when it arrives from a place you'd forgotten was still there. All right, she said. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a ceremony. It was two people in a kitchen they'd built together, in a valley that had tried to freeze them both in separate ways, deciding to stop putting distance between themselves and the thing they wanted. That was enough. That was more than enough. The summer of 1880 settled over Mercer Ridge with the unhurried confidence of a season that knows it's earned its place. The cattle drive that spring had gone better than the previous 2 years. Not dramatically better, not the kind of turnaround that makes for a clean story, but the incremental, unglamorous improvement of a ranch that had found its footing again and was building carefully from it. Rhett paid down a significant portion of the debt that had been sitting in that ledger book through all those winter evenings. Not all of it, but enough that the look he carried in his face when he thought nobody was watching grew fractionally lighter. The Iron Hearth, by late summer, had become what Mara had known it could be. Not famous, not a legend, but known. The kind of place that acquired a reputation not through spectacle, but through accumulated word. Travelers told other travelers, homesteaders told neighbors, and somewhere in the territory there were people who'd made a point of routing their travel past Black Hollow because of a kitchen at a ranch 9 miles northeast that fed you like you mattered. Men who'd once mocked her now said her name with the matter-of-fact pride of people who want credit for having been present at something before it was obvious. Dix Holloway, when travelers asked who'd started the Iron Hearth, said Mara Mercer, with a brevity that was his version of a long speech. Calhoun, whose hand had continued to improve through the summer with the twice-daily warm salt soak that had become as fixed a part of his morning routine as his coffee, had developed the habit of telling new hands on the ranch, with the grave authority of a man delivering important information. You want to understand how this place works? You go talk to Mara. She'll feed you, and she'll figure you out, in that order. Petra Delaney, who was 8 now, came to the Iron Hearth on the last Saturday of August and sat at the long table and watched Mara work for an hour without saying much. Then she said, very seriously, I want to learn to make bread. Mara looked at her. Your hands are big enough. How can you tell? Come here. She held Petra's small hand up against her own, the rough, work-darkened hand that had kneaded dough and stirred pots and counted fence posts in a blizzard and held the back of a sick man's neck while she measured his fever. Petra's hand was a child's hand, soft and quick and full of futures she didn't know about yet. Your hands will do, Mara said. Come back next Saturday. She let go of the small hand and went back to her work. She thought sometimes about what the version of herself in that Black Hollow cabin would make of this. That woman in November, banking a fire alone, telling herself that not being evicted was enough of a victory, filing away the idea of the ocean and the piano as things that had simply not been for her. She didn't know whether to feel sorry for that woman or grateful to her. Probably both. The thing about who you were in hard times was that you couldn't entirely separate it from who you became after. The person who survived the cold was also the person who learned to trust the warmth once it arrived. Love, she'd found, was not the thing she'd been told it was. It was not a reward for becoming worthy of it. It was not something earned through perfection or beauty or the careful shrinking of yourself to fit into the space someone else decided you deserved. It was something that came from being seen, genuinely, specifically, in the actual shape of yourself, and choosing to be present for that seeing rather than running from it. She had almost run from it, more than once. She was glad she hadn't. The western sky over Mercer Ridge held the colors of the dying summer, and in the kitchen of the iron hearth, the bread was in the oven and the soup was on the fire, and Casper was arguing with himself about the pie crust the way he always did at this stage, which meant it was going to be fine. And somewhere outside, Rhett was coming across the yard from the far barn the way he did every evening, following the same path he'd worn into the ground over years of his own particular persistence. She could hear his boots on the porch steps. She didn't look up from what she was doing. She didn't have to. She already knew the weight of those footsteps, the specific way they paused at the kitchen door. "Smells good," he said. "Sit down," she said. "Coffee's on." He sat. She poured. Outside, the frontier went on doing what it had always done, wide and indifferent, and beautiful and brutal in equal measure, asking nothing from the people on it except that they be equal to it. Some people were. Some people weren't. Mara Whitlock had never been sure which kind she was, until she'd had a winter to find out. She knew now. She picked up her spoon, Pierce's mother's spoon, smooth and dark from a lifetime of use, and she kept cooking.